A millionaire marries the boss's daughter as a joke, but later he is surprised to realize that this bet may change the way he sees the world. The exclusive club's hall oozed power and status. In the center of one of the most coveted tables, David Hayes basked in the compliments and greetings he was receiving. The freshly sealed contract marked a milestone for Campbell Corp, and as the key player in the negotiation, he was the man of the evening. Colleagues congratulated him, investors listened to his words with keen interest, and even Charles Campbell, the owner of the company, had given him a respectful nod before retreating to a private meeting with other magnates. David felt satisfied, but not excited. All of this, the celebrations, the luxury, the flattery, no longer had the same impact on him. He knew he was one of the best. Success was a constant, not a surprise. "You look like you'd rather be home sleeping," Ryan Vega, his best friend, and also an executive at Campbell Corporation, remarked. He sat beside David, placing a whiskey glass on the table. The great David Hayes closes a multi-million-dollar deal, and he's bored. David swirled the amber liquid in his glass before taking a sip. Not at all, just thinking how these celebrations are always the same. Gold-digging women, businessmen trying to strike up conversations, colleagues praising what we already know. The game is predictable. Ryan laughed, leaning back in his chair. "You need a challenge, something that really shakes you up." David raised an eyebrow, already anticipating some wild idea from his impulsive friend. Ryan was always a fan of bets and challenges that broke the routine. "I'm listening," he said, crossing his arms. Ryan took a generous gulp of whiskey before speaking, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. "I want to see if you're as good as you think. You're a master at getting what you want, right? Convincing investors, sealing impossible deals, charming any woman in this room. But can you convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced?" David frowned. "Be more specific." Ryan leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes sparkling with challenge. "Marry Mia Campbell. If you manage to convince her, I'll pay you a fortune." The name made David lean back in his chair, letting out an incredulous laugh. "You've got to be kidding." "I'm serious." "Mia Campbell? Charles's daughter?" Ryan smiled. "Exactly." David took another sip of whiskey, trying to make sense of why Ryan would even consider such an absurd idea. Mia Campbell wasn't just the boss's daughter. She was practically invisible in their world. He'd seen her a few times over the years, always from a distance, always unnoticed. It was impossible to miss her for all the wrong reasons. A woman with harsh features, no trace of delicacy or femininity, with a wide, shapeless body that went unnoticed at any event. Her stiff posture and lack of interest in mingling with the elite made her an anomaly in a world obsessed with appearances and status. She dressed carelessly, with no concern for pleasing the eyes of others. That was what made Ryan's suggestion even crazier. "Are you serious?" David asked, still unable to believe it. "Totally," Ryan confirmed. "Don't you think it would be a challenge? I want to see if you can break the daughter of the boss." David shook his head, finding the bet ridiculous, but at the same time, he couldn't shake off the idea immediately. He never turned down a good challenge, and Ryan knew that. "And how much are we talking about?" he asked, pretending to be uninterested. Ryan gave a triumphant smile. "A sum that's worth your while." Money wasn't the issue. David was already wealthy and would continue to grow within Campbell Corp. What really intrigued him was the feeling that this game was different. Mia wasn't like the women who typically flocked to men like him. She had never shown the slightest interest in the world she belonged to by birthright. Logically, she should be desperate for any kind of male attention. After all, she had never been seen with a boyfriend, never participated in social circles, never tried to fit in. For David, getting her to accept a marriage, even if it was just a joke, shouldn't be hard. The risk, practically non-existent. The reward, a nice sum of money and the pleasure of winning a challenge that no one else would dare attempt. David looked at Ryan, a confident smile creeping up his lips. "Fine, I'm in." Ryan laughed loudly, raising his whiskey glass. "That's how I like it!" They clinked glasses, and David felt a surge of adrenaline. Tomorrow, with a clearer mind, he might reconsider, but at that moment, the idea felt irresistible. He was a man of his word, never one to back out of a challenge, and if there was a way to win this bet, he knew he needed to act strategically. He spent the morning gathering information on Mia Campbell. Her last name carried weight, but she made sure to distance herself from her father's empire. A university professor specializing in social education, deeply involved in projects for underprivileged communities. She had no photos at social events, didn't show up in gossip columns, and didn't display her life on social media. She seemed completely indifferent to the world into which she was born. This only made the challenge more interesting. David knew he needed a pretext to meet her, and a direct invitation wouldn't work. Mia would ignore any attempt at contact if she sensed any hidden agenda. So he created a formal approach, a meeting to discuss a supposed educational project that Campbell Corp was planning to support. The message was sent by his assistant, with no details, just informing her that the company was interested in investing in the educational sector and wanted to benefit from her expertise. A company car would be available to pick her up at the university where she taught. Without question, Mia accepted the invitation. At the scheduled time, one of the company drivers parked at the campus entrance. Mia stepped out of the building, carrying a folder of documents and a notebook. She wore dark fabric pants and a loose blouse, shapeless and unremarkable. Her hair, tied in a loose bun, revealed her complete indifference to any aesthetic concerns. When she entered the car, she didn't even ask about the meeting. She simply opened her notebook and began reviewing her notes, as if she were headed to yet another routine commitment. Meanwhile, on the 25th floor of Campbell Corp, David awaited her arrival. He knew Mia's presence would make an impact, and he was right. When the elevator doors opened and she stepped into the lobby, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The receptionists exchanged looks, uncertain whether they should greet her. Executives talking near the company coffee station paused mid-sentence, their eyes drifting away. There was no hostility, just a quiet discomfort. In this world, women were always impeccable. Fitted dresses, high heels, makeup applied with precision. Mia was a stark contrast to all of that. But did she care? Not in the least. She walked confidently to the receptionist, introduced herself without ceremony, and made her way to the meeting room where David was waiting. When the door opened, he studied her intently. Mia didn't appear nervous or anxious. She simply looked him straight in the eye and said, "Let's make this quick. My time is limited." David smiled inwardly. He liked people who got to the point. "Thank you for coming, Mia. I know your schedule is tight," he said, indicating the chair across from him. She sat down, arms crossed, giving no room for pleasantries. "What's the project?" she asked. David leaned on the table, studying her for a moment before responding. "There is no project." She blinked slowly, showing no surprise. She merely tilted her head slightly, as if expecting a better explanation. "I brought you here to make you a proposal," he said. "What kind of proposal?" "A marriage." This time, Mia actually seemed surprised. "Have you completely lost your mind?" David remained calm. "It's a simple deal. We get married at the civil registry. No personal involvement. 6 months. After that, we divorce." Mia laughed, but not in amusement. "Did you drink too much last night?" "I don't drink during work hours," he replied. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms again. "Let's say I'm interested in hearing this madness. What exactly would I get out of it?" David realized he had her attention. "Your life stays the same. You keep your job, your routine. We just need to appear as a couple at social events." Mia twirled a pen between her fingers. "And why on earth would I do that?" David smiled. "You're a smart woman. You must know that a marriage like this could have its advantages." Mia sized him up, not responding right away. Then she leaned forward slightly. "You live in a world where everything can be bought, don't you?" He didn't respond. "But I'm not for sale," she continued. David kept his relaxed posture. "I never said I was trying to buy you. It's a trade of favors." She let out a soft laugh. "And what exactly do you gain from this?" David measured his words carefully. "Let's just say my image as an executive would be even more solid with a stable marriage." Mia smiled, but without any warmth. "And you chose the boss's daughter for this little charade?" David didn't hesitate. "You're a logical choice. You have no shallow interests, you won't try to take advantage of the situation, and above all, you couldn't care less about me." Mia stood up. "You think you know a lot about me, but you don't know anything." She grabbed the folder she had brought with her and gave David a cold look. "The answer is no." Without waiting for any reply, she turned and walked out of the room. David stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. He wasn't surprised by the refusal, but he sensed that Mia wasn't the type to reject something without a real reason. There was a way to make her change her mind. That night, back at his apartment, David reviewed the information he had on her until he found something interesting. Mia was involved in a social project that was desperately in need of funding. Mia had never asked her father for funding because she knew that Charles Campbell didn't support anything that didn't bring immediate profit or prestige to his image. To him, social projects were a waste of time and money, naive initiatives that didn't fit into the ruthless logic of business. Additionally, Mia had always made a point of distancing herself from her father's influence, refusing any privilege that came from the Campbell corporate empire. Asking Charles for help would mean admitting dependence, and she preferred to fight with her own resources than accept anything that would make her another pawn in his game. The next morning, he sent her an email. "Mia, I know you turned down my proposal, but I want to make you a new offer. If you accept, I'll guarantee full funding for your project. Think about it." And then he waited. "If you're still watching, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel." David didn't have to wait long. A few hours after sending his proposal, his inbox pinged with her reply. The email was short, direct, and devoid of any emotion. "I accept. Civil registry, Wednesday, 9 a.m. Don't be late." No room for negotiation. No questions asked. No hesitation or enthusiasm. He stared at the screen for a few seconds, processing the coldness of the message. He had expected resistance, maybe an attempt to renegotiate the terms. But Mia Campbell didn't seem interested in discussing details. To her, it was just a deal. David let out a soft laugh and uncrossed his arms. This should make things easier, but somehow it made the situation even more intriguing. On the designated morning, he arrived at the registry office 15 minutes ahead of schedule. His dark, tailored suit fit perfectly, his shoes gleaming, and the subtle woodsy fragrance completed the impeccable image. If this had been a real wedding, he'd have been ready to charm any bride. But Mia wasn't just any bride. She arrived promptly at 9, stepping out of a plain rideshare car, carrying only a folder of documents. She wore a cheap grey suit, devoid of any details that might soften her austere appearance. Her hair was tied back in an unremarkable fashion, with no makeup to speak of. No jewelry. When he saw her, David realized Mia hadn't bothered to make the slightest effort to appear as a bride. She had no intention of concealing her indifference, and it became even more obvious when she simply nodded at him before walking into the registry office without a word. Inside the cold, bureaucratic room, they were called up to the counter to sign the papers. The justice of the peace read the formalities in a monotonous tone, and the employees conducted the ceremony with the impersonal attitude of those who had overseen hundreds of meaningless weddings. Neither of them showed any emotion. No rings were exchanged, no photos were taken. At the end of the procedure, the justice of the peace cleared his throat before concluding. "Now you may seal your commitment with a kiss, if you wish." David, accustomed to this sort of formality in traditional weddings, leaned in slightly toward Mia. It wouldn't be a real kiss, just a symbolic gesture. But before he could complete the movement, Mia extended her hand and firmly shook his. "That's enough," she said without changing her expression. The gesture was deliberate, with no room for misinterpretation. A clear, impenetrable barrier. David felt a mixture of surprise and amusement. He had never encountered a woman who didn't at least pretend to be involved in order to keep up appearances, but Mia didn't care what anyone thought. She saw no reason to maintain any illusions. Without question, he returned the handshake and signed the final document. The ceremony, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 20 minutes. Neither of them mentioned the presence of friends or family. Charles Campbell hadn't even sent a representative. And so, without flowers, vows, or celebration, David and Mia were officially married. When they left the registry office, David suggested they have dinner to discuss how they would maintain appearances at social events. He wanted to set clear rules, establish boundaries, and make sure everything went smoothly. "I have a lecture at the university," Mia immediately responded. "It can be another day," he insisted. "I see no need. Our agreement is in place. The rest is detail." She looked at him with an unsettling calmness. David was used to dealing with people who tried to please him, impress him, or manipulate him. But Mia didn't show any of those intentions. It was as if he didn't matter to her. He watched as she called for a rideshare car and disappeared into the busy avenue. That night, while reviewing contracts in his office, David realized his mind kept returning to Mia more often than he liked, not because of the marriage itself, but because of the woman who had accepted the deal without hesitation and at the same time seemed completely indifferent to him. He grabbed his phone and called his assistant. "I want a full report on Mia Campbell's social projects. As many details as you can get." "Any specific points, sir?" David hesitated for a moment before answering. "I want to understand better what really matters to her." And as he said this, he realized that this bet was already spiraling out of control. David's curiosity about Mia wouldn't let him rest. He tried to rationalize it, attribute his unease to the simple desire to understand the woman he was now married to. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. There was something about her that challenged him in a way no one ever had before. That's why he decided to take her to Campbell Corpus charity event. It would be a test. He wanted to see how Mia would react when exposed to the social circle she had spent her whole life avoiding. That night, the ballroom of the five-star hotel in the heart of Mexico City was dazzling. Huge chandeliers illuminated the impeccable decor, where floral arrangements and crystal tables showcased the sophistication expected of the elite. Men in sharp suits and women in stunning dresses glided through the room with practiced smiles and superficial conversations. Among glasses of champagne and empty toasts, politicians, businessmen, and socialites eagerly awaited what they considered the great spectacle of the evening, the arrival of David Hayes' wife. The gossip had already started before Mia even stepped into the ballroom. "Does she really exist?" one investor joked, sipping a glass of whiskey. "The disowned daughter of Campbell. I can't believe she agreed to show up." "Do you think she made an effort to look presentable?" David heard the comments, but he didn't react. He was used to that kind of people. He knew they were just waiting for a slip-up, a mistake they could use to ridicule Mia. They wanted to see her feel out of place, uncomfortable, But Mia wasn't going to give them that pleasure. She entered the ballroom without hesitation, standing tall, her gaze firm. She wore a simple black dress made of heavy fabric, straight-cut and unadorned. It was understated, discreet, but undeniably elegant. Her hair was styled in a low bun, without sophistication but impeccably neat. No flashy jewelry, no details to draw unnecessary attention. And yet she attracted every eye. The whispers grew quieter but didn't stop. Some women looked her up and down, searching for flaws. Men shot discreet glances, wondering if her appearance was as bad as they'd imagined. But Mia didn't care. Without waiting for David to guide her, she began to circulate through the room. With the same ease, she navigated the hallways of the university. She greeted people, joined conversations. But she made no effort to fit in. She didn't laugh at empty jokes, didn't try to please anyone. She spoke when necessary, and when she did, she spoke with precision, and that was what began to irritate the guests. Because Mia Campbell, unlike what everyone had expected, wasn't a woman who needed their approval. She didn't avoid their stares. She met them head-on. She didn't shy away from conversations. She entered them, and in no time took control. David watched her from afar, fascinated. He expected discomfort, perhaps a slip-up. But Mia was at ease, and more than that, little by little, she began to attract genuine attention. First, a minister took an interest in her opinion on educational reforms. Then, a businessman from the technology sector started discussing the impact of innovation on public education with her. A renowned economist who had previously been talking boredly with a group of investors abandoned his circle to listen to her. The game had turned. Meanwhile, in a more secluded corner, the group of businessmen David usually associated with watched the scene with distaste. "I don't understand what he's doing with her," one executive murmured. "Arranged marriage. Has to be. Did you see how she is? She doesn't compare to the women he used to date. Disgusting. He looks like a prince beside her." David, who had long learned to ignore this kind of conversation, felt something different this time. A frustration that rose unexpectedly, hitting him hard. Before he realized it, he turned to the men around him and said, "Funny, because so far none of you have spoken with half the intelligence she has." The silence was immediate. The executive who had made the last comment cleared his throat and looked away. Another tried to laugh, but the laugh died before it could fully form. David didn't say another word. He simply picked up his drink and walked away. When he found Mia again, she was at the center of a lively conversation. Some men were trying to challenge her, but she responded with solid arguments and a calm tone. David approached and watched for a moment. She was brilliant, and he had never noticed that before. Something stirred within him. The bet, which had once seemed like a mere game, now made him feel an unease he couldn't define. As though, for the first time, he was questioning himself, his choices, and the way he saw the world. And Mia was the reason for this. He glanced at his drink, swirling the liquid in his glass, unsure of what to think. But one thing was clear. Mia Campbell was no ordinary woman, and that bothered him more than it should have. David couldn't forget that night. The charity event had been supposed to be just a game of appearances, a formality. But Mia had turned everything upside down. Against all expectations, she didn't just survive the night, she dominated it. She left businessmen unsettled, caught the attention of intellectuals, and made people who would usually ignore her stop to listen. And for the first time, David found himself looking at her differently. It wasn't attraction, it wasn't romantic interest. It was curiosity. Mia Campbell wasn't just the woman he had married as part of a stupid bet. She was an enigma, a mystery that he, a man used to deciphering people with ease, still couldn't comprehend. In the days that followed, David began observing her more closely, not in an obvious way, but with a different kind of attention. He had expected that after the event, Mia would show some kind of change. Maybe a little pride in what she had done, a hint of satisfaction for silencing her critics. But Mia went on with her routine as if nothing had happened. She didn't mention the event. She didn't talk about the people she met. She didn't ask David what he thought of her performance. For her, that night hadn't been a test, not even a victory. It had simply been another ordinary night, and that bothered him. Mia was completely indifferent to him. Unlike the women David was used to dealing with, she didn't show the slightest interest in impressing him. She never tried to start a conversation. She didn't make an effort to be present when he arrived home. She kept busy with her work at the university and her social projects, as though David were just a minor detail in her life. And in a way, he was. This realization irritated him more than it should have. He needed to understand Mia. That's when he decided to propose a dinner. One evening, while she was preparing to leave, he casually suggested, "Let's have dinner together tonight." Mia looked up from the book she was putting in her bag. "For what?" "To talk. We're still married, even if just on paper. Don't you think it would be useful for us to get to know each other better?" She considered it for a moment, then shrugged. "As long as it's quick. I have papers to grade afterward." It was the least enthusiastic acceptance David had ever gotten from a woman. He chose an elegant restaurant, but Mia refused. "Let's have dinner at home. No need for theatrics." With no other choice, he agreed. The dinner was served in the large dining room of his apartment. The table, too big for just two people, made the atmosphere even colder. The food, prepared by a renowned chef, seemed overly sophisticated for the simplicity of the situation. Mia ate in silence, showing no signs of haste or discomfort. David, on the other hand, was restless. He had expected the night to be a bit different. That, with time and privacy, Mia would show some vulnerability, some sign of uncertainty about her place beside him. But Mia was unshakable, and what was worse, she seemed to see him as nothing. When David spoke, she listened, but not with the admiration or interest he was used to receiving. She didn't try to please him, didn't laugh at his comments, didn't ask about his life. He, who had always been the center of attention, was now just another voice in the room. At one point in the conversation, David tried to turn this around. "You judge the business world too much," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "But maybe you should look at it from a different angle. Not everything is about money and power. There's strategy, innovation, vision." Mia set her utensils down and looked at him with a half smile. "And is that what makes you feel great?" David frowned. "What do you mean? You think power and money make you a great man?" He leaned back in his chair. "That's what defines success. Achieving, growing, being the best at what you do." Mia simply laughed without irony. "For me, you're just another guy who thinks he's invincible because he's never had to fight for real." The comment hit him like an invisible punch. He opened his mouth to retort, but stopped himself. Because, for the first time, he realized Mia didn't see him as a brilliant businessman, nor as a powerful man. She saw him as predictable, and that bothered him more than any criticism he had ever received in his life. Mia finished her dinner without saying another word. She stood up, thanked him for the meal, and left the room with the same calmness she had arrived with. David stayed behind, staring at the empty chair across from him. The unease within him grew, because for the first time, someone made him question if everything he had accomplished was really significant, and that feeling drove him crazy. David spent the following days trying to ignore the discomfort Mia had left inside him, but he failed miserably. He had never cared about anyone's opinion, so why the hell did her words keep echoing in his mind? "You're just another one who thinks he's invincible because he's never had to fight for real." He wanted to contest, to argue, to prove she was wrong, but for that, he would need to understand where that unshakable conviction came from. He needed to see with his own eyes what made Mia think that way. So, on a random night, he made the proposal. "I want to visit one of your projects," he said casually, as she organized papers in the living room. Mia looked up. "Why?" "I want to understand better what you do." She crossed her arms, evaluating him with that analytical gaze that always unsettled him. "You want to understand, or you want to prove something?" David didn't hesitate. "I want to understand." Mia was silent for a moment, then grabbed her bag and began packing some documents. "Tomorrow morning, I'll pick you up at 7. 7? He raised an eyebrow. "If you really want to understand, you'll have to leave your little luxury world behind," she replied flatly. David just smiled faintly. The next morning, he waited for Mia in the lobby of his building. He wore dark jeans and a shirt with rolled-up sleeves, casual clothes he rarely wore. He was used to driving luxurious cars, but this time he was just a passenger. Mia arrived without ceremony in a simple car, no driver. He got in and observed as she drove without rushing, following streets that took them further away from the city center. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked, noticing the change in scenery. "Iztapalapa neighborhood," she replied. David recognized the name. It was one of the most peripheral areas of Mexico City, far from the towering skyscrapers and upscale restaurants he frequented. Slowly, the well-maintained asphalt gave way to worn streets full of potholes. The buildings' facades were simple, many covered in graffiti, some unfinished. Modest shops, narrow streets, children playing barefoot on the sidewalks. David felt completely out of place. When they reached the community center, the first thing he noticed was the simplicity of the place. The two-story building with a worn facade didn't look impressive. Nothing there was sophisticated, nothing reminded him of the luxury he was used to. But there was something in the air that made him hesitate for a moment before getting out of the car. There was life. Children ran around the yard, laughing loudly. Some women were organizing donations while others guided small groups of students in school tasks. Young volunteers were dividing their time between tutoring, recreational activities, and community services. David had never seen anything like it up close. Mia got out of the car with the ease of someone who did this every day. He, on the other hand, felt like a stranger there. "Come on," she called, and he followed her. As they entered the center, they were greeted with enthusiasm. Volunteers greeted her with respect, and some children ran to hug her. Different from the coldness she displayed in the corporate world, here Mia smiled with genuine familiarity. David observed everything closely. She wasn't just a teacher supporting a project from a distance. She was involved. She knew these people. She knew their names, their stories. She spoke to the children as if they were her own students, encouraged the young volunteers, helped organize activities. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked when they finally had a moment alone. "Since I realized that just complaining about the system wouldn't change anything." David looked around. Some walls had marks of infiltration, the furniture was old, the computers outdated. "Do you get help from the government?" "Some incentives, but they're minimal. Most comes from private donations and charity events." "Does Charles know about this?" Mia gave him an ironic smile. "My father doesn't invest in things that don't bring immediate profit." David fell silent. As she spoke to one of the center's coordinators, a girl no older than 8 approached him. Dark hair, brown skin, big, curious eyes. "Do you help here too?" David blinked, taken aback. I'm just getting to know the project." The girl frowned, thinking, "Well, I hope you like it and really want to help." He felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. Before he could answer, the girl smiled and ran off to play with her friends. David let out a long sigh. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his world was too small. Later, when he was back in his apartment, he poured himself a shot of whiskey and sat in the living room chair, staring at the glass with a lost look. Why couldn't he stop thinking about that place? Why did that girl, that simple question, affect him so much? He had always believed success was about power, money, and recognition. But today, seeing Mia working in that community center, he realized there was another kind of fulfillment. Something that didn't come from numbers or contracts. Something he had never experienced. And maybe Mia was right about many things. David knew that his visit to the community center would not go unnoticed. In the corporate world, every move carried weight. And Charles Campbell, a man who never left anything to chance, would certainly notice the shift in his most promising employee. In the following days, David sensed the subtle glances in the company hallways. Executives whispered when he passed, and even Ryan, his longtime friend, made a sarcastic comment over lunch. "Since when do you care about charity?" David didn't respond. The truth was, even he didn't know. When the invitation for a private meeting with Charles arrived, he had been expecting it. The boss's office was large, luxurious, and imposing. Dark wood furniture, panoramic windows that showcased the skyline of Mexico City, and an atmosphere that exuded power. Charles Campbell sat behind his desk, his analytical gaze fixed on David. "Sit down," he ordered bluntly. David obeyed. The initial silence was deliberate, a strategy Charles often used to test others. But David knew the game. He remained unfazed, waiting for the businessman to speak first. "I've always admired your dedication," Charles began, crossing his fingers on the desk. "Your talent for closing deals, your strategic vision, these are rare qualities." David remained silent. "But lately I've noticed that your attention seems distracted." David raised an eyebrow. "Distracted?" Charles leaned slightly forward. "I hear you've been visiting some community projects." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. David kept his relaxed posture. "I went to visit one of Mia's projects, that's all." Charles smiled, but there was something cold in that smile. "Mia has always had this obsession with social causes, but that's not your case. So I wonder, what exactly are you looking for?" David recognized the trap hidden in the question. Charles was testing his loyalty. "Just curiosity," he replied in a neutral tone. The businessman leaned back in his chair, assessing him. "Success demands focus, David. I hope you still have yours." David didn't respond immediately. Charles was making it clear that he didn't like the influence Mia might be having on him. "My focus remains the company," he assured, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. Charles nodded, but his gaze remained sharp. "Good, because I have plans for you. Big plans, but for that, you need to be on the right path." David understood the implicit warning. The meeting ended quietly, but David left the office feeling a different weight on his shoulders. Throughout his career, he had never doubted what he wanted. He was a businessman, someone who understood that the world revolved around profit, power, and strategy. But now something was changing, and he didn't know how to deal with it. That night, as he sipped coffee in his apartment's kitchen, he decided to tell Mia about his conversation with Charles. Not because he expected advice from her, but because he wanted to see her reaction. When he finished recounting the conversation, Mia simply observed him for a few moments. "Are you surprised?" David furrowed his brow. "Not exactly, but it's curious how quickly he reacted." Mia gave a half smile. "My father doesn't worry about the wrong things. He worries when something threatens his perfectly structured system." "And you think I'm a threat?" Mia tilted her head, assessing him with that look that always unsettled him. "Do you think so?" David didn't answer. "The question isn't whether you want to keep being who you were, Mia said, her voice calm and cutting. "The question is whether you can already see who you could be." The words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. Mia wasn't saying that he needed to change. She was asking if he had already realized he was changing. David twirled the cup in his hands, deep in thought. For the first time, he felt there was something far greater than money and power waiting for him. And maybe he was ready to see it. David tried to push Mia's words out of his mind. He tried to convince himself that all of this was just a fleeting distraction, a temporary unease. But as the days passed, reality pulled him back with force. Campbell Corp's numbers started to fluctuate. At first it was subtle, small delays in supplier payments, meetings being cancelled without warning. Then more alarmingly, contracts that seemed guaranteed were abruptly interrupted. Investors began to show hesitation, and disturbing rumors started spreading through the market. David, who always had a sharp instinct for crises, noticed that something was wrong before the reports confirmed it. Campbell Corp was an empire, and empires didn't tremble for no reason. In the first emergency meeting with the board, Charles Campbell downplayed the situation. "It's temporary," he said, with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Just some minor market disruptions. We've been through worse." But David wasn't convinced. Something bigger was happening. He decided to investigate on his own. He delved into the financial reports, reviewed contracts, and cross-checked data. For days, he buried himself in documents and confidential meetings, trying to identify the origin of the problem. Finally, he found a pattern. The heart of the crisis was centered around a Campbell Corp project to build a new commercial complex on land that had previously been home to a low-income community. The company, as usual, had obtained all the necessary legal approvals for the development. But this time, there was resistance that didn't come from politicians or environmentalists, but from a social initiative that was mobilizing public opinion against the project. David reviewed the documents related to the opposition, and among the names involved, one stood out that sent a chill down his spine: Mia Campbell. For a moment he froze, staring at the computer screen. The truth hit him hard. Mia was sabotaging the company. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and called her. The call went straight to voicemail. Without a second thought, he grabbed his car keys and drove to the university where she worked. When he arrived, he found her leaving one of the classrooms, talking with some students. She saw him approaching and immediately recognized the expression on his face. Fury. "I need to talk to you. Now." Mia nodded, saying goodbye to the students before leading him to a more secluded hallway. "I guess you figured it out," she said, crossing her arms. "You're sabotaging Campbell Corp," David said bluntly. "I'm defending people who would be crushed by another irresponsible project from my father's company." "It's your last name, Mia. Do you even realize what you're doing?" She gave a small smile, devoid of humor. "I do, more than you think." David took a deep breath, trying to control his irritation. "You can't just go against your own father's company." "I'm not against anyone, David. I'm in favor of something." He stared at her, trying to decipher if she was being naive or just too stubborn to see what she was doing. "Do you know what happens to those who challenge Charles Campbell?" he asked, his voice quieter but full of warning. Mia kept her gaze firm. "I know exactly what my father is capable of." David felt a knot form in his stomach. "So explain it to me. Why are you so determined to fight against him?" Mia stared at him for a long moment, as if deciding how much she was willing to share. Then she took a deep breath and said, "Because this isn't the first time Campbell Corp has destroyed something to build its buildings." David furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" She looked at him with an expression that he had never seen before. Pain. "The community center you visited barely survived. It's standing only because a few people refused to let it die." David felt his stomach tighten. "Continue," he whispered. Mia crossed her arms and held his gaze. The man who founded the institution dedicated his entire life to educating underprivileged children. He started with a small community library, a modest space, but one that served as a refuge for many families in the area. For years it grew, received donations, began offering courses and activities. It became more than a library. It became a beacon of hope for that community. David knew where this was going, but he stayed silent. Until Campbell Corp decided it needed that land for a new skyscraper. Mia took a step closer, her voice low but firm. "My father bought the right politicians, ignored protests, forced the eviction. The library was demolished in a matter of days. The founder, a man who had never asked for anything from anyone, tried to resist until the last minute, but he lost everything." David looked away for a moment, a bitter taste in his mouth. What happened to him? He died shortly after. He couldn't bear the loss. It was too much for him. David rubbed his face. "And you never told anyone about this?" Mia let out a bitter laugh. "Why would I? To hear the same empty justification, just business." He swallowed hard. "And that's why you took over the community center?" Mia nodded. "Everything that was left of it, what I could save. I took all that remained, all the volunteers who were still there, and I turned it into that project. And now you want to destroy it again." David felt a tightening in his chest. For the first time, his view of the corporate world seemed wrong, because this time the impact had a name, a face, and he didn't know what to do with it. Later, back at Campbell Corp, David went straight to his boss's office. Charles was reviewing documents when he lifted his gaze to him. "Is something wrong?" David closed the door behind him. "You knew that the library we destroyed years ago was what kept that community center alive." Charles didn't flinch. "Of course I knew." David felt a bitter taste in his mouth. "And you never cared?" The businessman studied him with a calm expression. "It was just business, David. There are always winners and losers." David felt something inside him snap. For the first time, he wasn't sure whose side he should be on. David left Charles's office, feeling that something inside him had changed. Before, when making decisions, everything had been black and white, profit or loss, victory or failure. But now, after hearing his boss speak so coldly about the past, about the destruction of that library and Mia's resistance, David realized he was in the middle of a much bigger battle than he had ever imagined. And for the first time, he didn't know whose side he was on. In the following days, the situation within Campbell Corp became unbearable. The conflict with Mia's social project was no longer a small, discrete issue. It gained traction in the media, on social networks, and among investors. Headlines began questioning the company's ethics. Protests started to form in front of the land where the new development was supposed to be built. Some public figures spoke out against the destruction of the community center. Investors, ever vigilant about the reputation of where they put their money, began to pressure Charles. Constant phone calls, emergency meetings, demands for explanations. They wanted to know why the company was associated with a crisis that could ruin its public image. David was in the middle of it all. He was the bridge between Charles and the market. He had always been the rational face of Campbell Corp, the man who calmed investors, mediated crises, and turned problems into opportunities. But this time, he saw that it wasn't enough to just manage the situation. Because, deep down, he knew Mia was right. And more than that, he didn't want to be the man who would help bury a project that was making a difference in so many people's lives. He spent hours analyzing contracts, studying numbers, trying to find a solution that wouldn't involve destroying the community center. He needed a way out, something that would work for the company, but also wouldn't annihilate what Mia was fighting to preserve. Then he found a path. It wasn't simple, but it was possible. If Campbell Corp gave up a part of the land and restructured the project to include social initiatives within the new development, they could turn the crisis into an opportunity. Instead of being seen as the villain, the company could position itself as an innovative corporation concerned with social impact. It was a risk, but it was a risk that could save not only the company's image, but also the community center. The only thing missing was convincing Charles Campbell. David arranged a private meeting with him. No board members, no intermediaries. He knew that if he wanted any chance at all, he had to face him alone. When he entered the office, Charles was reading a financial report, not even looking up at him. "What now?" he asked without any emotion. David sat down across from him, placing a folder on the desk. "I have a solution for the crisis," he said. Charles finally looked at him. "Great. I hope it involves getting those useless activists out of our way as soon as possible." David kept his calm. "No, it involves changing the way we approach this project." Charles narrowed his eyes. "Change?" David opened the folder, showing documents and projections. "If we adjust the plan, we can integrate social initiatives into the development. We don't need to destroy the community center. We can incorporate it into the structure, make it a part of our project, something that brings long-term benefits and makes a positive impact." Charles listened without interrupting, but his face remained impassive. When David finished, he closed the folder with a sharp movement. Then he laughed, a low laugh filled with disdain. "I built this company by crushing obstacles, David. And I'm not going to stop now just because you've been poisoned by your wife's idealistic fantasies." David's blood boiled. "If we keep going down this path, we'll lose more than money. We'll lose any credibility we have left." Charles's gaze hardened. "Then maybe you're not the man I thought you were." The silence between them was thick, loaded with a weight David had never felt before. If in the past Charles had said something like that, David would have worked hard to prove him wrong. He would have shown that he was indeed the ideal man for business, that he knew exactly what to do to strengthen the company. But at that moment, he realized that he no longer wanted to be the man Charles thought he should be. Without saying another word, he stood up and left the room. That night, when he got home, he found Mia sitting in the living room, grading papers. She looked up when he entered, noticing his tense expression, but returned her focus to the papers without saying a word. David dropped his keys on the table and ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "I had a meeting with your father," he said. Mia turned the page of the test she was correcting. "I imagine it was productive," she replied. David let out a short, humorless laugh. "If by productive you mean he basically called me an idiot for trying to resolve things differently, then yes." Mia put the pen down and finally looked at him. "You proposed an alternative?" "Yes." He rejected it? Completely. She sighed but didn't seem surprised. David crossed his arms and looked at her. "I tried." Mia held his gaze for a moment. "I know." For a second, David expected her to smile or celebrate the fact that he had finally tried to see things from her perspective. But Mia did none of that. She simply said, "You finally understood, but understanding isn't enough. Now you need to act." David felt a shiver down his spine, because for the first time, he knew Mia was right, and this time, he couldn't ignore it. David knew that Charles wouldn't let his insubordination go unnoticed, but he didn't expect the retaliation to come so quickly. The next morning, when he arrived at Campbell Corp, he immediately sensed that something was different. The atmosphere was colder, the greetings were more subdued. Some employees looked away when he passed by, as though they knew something he didn't. The confirmation came when he opened his corporate email. An internal memo announced a reorganization of the board positions. His name was still listed, but his role within the company had been drastically reduced. He wasn't fired, but he lost autonomy, influence, and access to crucial information. Charles had been clear, divided loyalty wasn't tolerated. David slowly closed his laptop, processing the situation. This wasn't just a professional blow. It was a direct message. For a moment, he thought about confronting Charles, demanding an explanation. But what could he say? That it was unfair. Charles Campbell didn't believe in fairness. He believed in power. If David stayed, he wouldn't be the same David Hayes anymore. He'd just be a name in an empty chair, without a voice, without relevance. For the first time in years, he realized his time at Campbell Corp was coming to an end. But if this chapter of his life was closing, he needed to decide what would come next. In the following days, David began exploring options that had never crossed his mind before. He was still a strong name in the market, a respected strategist. Some doors had closed due to fear of Charles, but others opened, eager to see what his next move would be. He met with investors, analyzed trends, studied sustainable business models. For the first time, he wasn't just looking for profit. He wanted something that made sense. Something that proved economic development and social impact didn't have to be opposing forces, but he still didn't know how to turn that idea into something concrete. Then Mia walked into the room and, without any introduction, threw a folder onto the table. "I have a proposal," she said. David raised an eyebrow, picking up the documents. "This is new. I thought you didn't make proposals, just reject mine." Mia crossed her arms. "It's about time you started thinking beyond what you've lost." He opened the folder and skimmed through the first few pages. Social projects, investment strategies, financial projections. The idea was ambitious. A social investment fund that would direct resources to companies committed to sustainable development and positive impact. David let out a low laugh, impressed. "You want me to join you in this fight against your father's company?" Mia looked at him without blinking. "I want you to choose what you truly believe in." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any argument he could give against her idea. David closed the folder and ran his hand over his face. He knew what that decision meant. If he accepted, he would be officially going up against Charles Campbell. He would throw away everything he had built within Campbell Corp, burn bridges, and become a direct adversary of the man he had once considered a mentor. But for the first time, he saw a greater purpose than money and status. He looked at Mia, who was staring at him with that unwavering serenity, without pressure, without expectation. She was simply waiting for him to make the decision on his own. Then he spoke. "I'm in." The next morning, David scheduled one last meeting with Charles. The businessman was waiting for him in his office, sitting behind the desk with the same authoritarian posture he always had. He didn't seem surprised when David walked in. "I imagine this isn't a visit to apologize," he said. David sat down across from him, taking his time. "I'm leaving Campbell Corp," he said. Charles nodded slowly, as if he had already expected this. "I thought you were smarter than this. But it seems my daughter has poisoned your mind with this illusion of a better world." David maintained a firm expression. "The world can stay as it always was, Charles, but I don't want to be part of the side that only destroys." The businessman laughed humorlessly. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." David took a deep breath. "No, I'm starting to live it for real." Without waiting for a reply, he stood up and walked out of the room. This time, he didn't look back. David's decision caused an immediate impact. The moment his departure from Campbell Corporans was announced, the market reacted with a mixture of shock and speculation. David Hayes was not just a promising executive. He had been considered the future of the company. No one expected him to leave everything so abruptly. Rumors spread quickly. Some headlines suggested he had been betrayed by Charles Campbell, a victim of an internal move to push him out of power. Others speculated that he had gone bankrupt, that he had lost his influence and was left with no alternatives. But the real reason remained unknown to the public. David didn't bother to clarify anything. He knew that leaving Campbell Corp wasn't an end, but a new beginning. In the following days, he dived deep into the social investment fund project. With Mia by his side and a select group of investors who believed in the idea, he began building the foundation for something that could never have been possible within Campbell Corp. A business model that united economic growth with social impact. The concept was simple, but bold. Companies that demonstrated commitment to social responsibility would receive investments and strategic support. It wasn't enough to generate profit. They also needed to create change. At first, there was resistance. Many in the market saw the project as overly idealistic, a risky move that wouldn't hold up in the real world. But as the first results started to come in, perceptions began to shift. The fund grew faster than anyone had expected. Small businesses joined the initiative, followed by medium-sized corporations, and eventually even some industry giants started to reconsider their practices. What had seemed like an impossible dream was beginning to take shape. And with that, David began to be seen in a different light. Before, he had been just a powerful name in the business world, a talented executive within a big corporation. Now, he was becoming something bigger, a visionary leader, someone who not only understood numbers, but saw beyond them. One evening, he and Mia were sitting at the table in their small office, going over reports and discussing strategies. The clock had already passed midnight, but neither of them seemed willing to stop. Mia closed one of the reports and looked at him. "If we're going to do this together, then do it right," she said. David furrowed his brow, not understanding at first. "What do you mean?" Mia reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. "If you want to be my husband, then make it official." For a moment, David was taken aback. He looked at the ring in her hand, feeling something stir within him in a way he had never experienced before. This time, there were no contracts, no bets, no hidden interests, just the two of them. David took her hand, holding the ring between his fingers. "Are you sure?" Mia smiled faintly. "You're not the same man who made that ridiculous bet, David. And I'm not the same woman who accepted it out of pure pragmatism." He took a deep breath and looked into her eyes. "Then let's do this right." The second wedding was completely different from the first. There was no cold bureaucracy, no papers signed as if it were just a business transaction. It was intimate, with no fanfare, just the two of them and a few close people. A small garden, sincere vows, and a commitment that for the first time had nothing to do with convenience. This time, David didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone, and as he held Mia's hand, he knew that this had been the best choice of his life. The growth of the investment fund led by David and Mia was meteoric. What started as an alternative initiative quickly became one of the most promising, sustainable business models in the country. Companies began to adopt the concept, seeing it as a new way to grow that didn't rely solely on exploitation and immediate profit. Meanwhile, Campbell Corp was going in the opposite direction. Charles Campbell, as inflexible as ever, refused to accept the changes in the market. To him, innovation was a sign of weakness. He believed the company he built should continue to operate the same way it always had, aggressive, authoritarian, and ruthless. But the business world was no longer the same. The crisis, which started as a minor disturbance, soon turned into a devastating storm. Investors began questioning the company's strategies. Million-dollar contracts were cancelled. Projects that once seemed certain encountered legal obstacles and public resistance. Campbell Corp's image deteriorated rapidly, and with it its financial stability. Charles Campbell's fall was inevitable. He fought. He tried to regain market confidence. He tried to reverse the damage. He tried, as he always had, to crush the competition. But this time there was no one to crush. The real adversary was not a rival company. It was time. And then, when Campbell Corp finally reached its breaking point, Charles was forced to do something he never imagined. He had to ask for help. The cruel and ironic fate placed in front of him a single rescue proposal capable of saving the company. And that proposal came from none other than David Hayes, the man he had discarded, the employee he had underestimated, the son he had never recognized as his own. The invitation for a meeting came from the company's board of directors, who no longer trusted Charles to solve the crisis. David, now an influential investor, received the call with the calmness of someone who knew that this moment would come sooner or later. On the scheduled day, he entered Charles's office without hurry, as though the place had never stopped belonging to him. The once imposing atmosphere seemed smaller now. The weight of failure hung in the air on the tired posture of the man behind the desk. Charles looked at him, expecting a smug smile, a provocation, a display of superiority. But David simply sat down across from him and said calmly, "Let's talk business." The silence that followed was heavy. Charles finally exhaled, leaning back in his chair. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only exhaustion. "Are you going to tell me you won?" he asked without preamble. David crossed his fingers on the desk. "This isn't about winning or losing. It's about building something that lasts." The businessman studied him for a moment. "And you think you can save Campbell Corp?" "I know I can, but not the way you want." David slid a folder across the desk. "If I take control, the company will be restructured. We'll eliminate predatory practices. We'll operate transparently and sustainably. Campbell Corp will no longer be a symbol of exploitation. It will become a model of responsible business." Charles flipped through the documents, the charts, the projections. "Do you want to turn my company into a charity?" he sneered. David remained calm. "I want to make it relevant again." The silence stretched. And then, for the first time in his life, Charles Campbell looked at David with something he had never shown before: respect. 2 weeks later, the deal was finalized. Campbell Corp officially came under the control of David's investment fund. Changes were immediate. Projects were re-evaluated, abusive contracts were terminated, and new policies were implemented. Charles Campbell's empire no longer existed. In its place, a new model of business emerged, and with it, a new legacy. Years later, on a quiet evening, David sat on the balcony of his home, gazing at the city in the distance. Next to him, Mia was reviewing reports for new projects the fund was financing. He watched her for a moment, admiring how she did everything with purpose, with passion. "Do you remember the day you told me that understanding wasn't enough?" he asked. Mia looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Yes." David stared out at the horizon. "I think I understand completely now." She closed the report and leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "And was it worth it?" He took her hand and smiled. "Every second." And there, on that balcony next to the woman who had changed his life, David knew that his greatest achievement wasn't financial, it was finding a purpose.